I predict this is going to be a great episode. But as you'll find out, a lot of predictions are wrong. I really hope I'm not wrong this time, though. You're listening to the Property Podcast. I'm Rob B with Rob D. And this week, we're finding out that the experts might not be so sharp after all.
Welcome to the Property Podcast, where every Thursday property investors come to be informed and inspired. Yesterday, we are doing the one thing that nobody who makes a prediction ever wants you to do, which is to go back and see in hindsight whether that prediction was correct or not. And we're not just doing it to be mean. There are some very important lessons that come out of this discussion that you need to know about. So keep listening for that and stick around to the end, because in Hub Extra, we've got a brand new podcast to recommend that's been created by a Property Podcast listener.
So it's time for our news story of the week, Rob. And Rob, I canine believe this one.
Yeah, landlords were definitely given pause last week when this news story broke, because the way it's been presented in the media is shockingly not entirely accurate. So the headline from This Is Money is Pets in Lets. Government makes it harder to impose blanket bans on tenants having animals. And the way this has been reported makes it sound like you now have to accept pets by default and have to object case by case if you specifically don't want them. In fact, though, that is not the case. All they've done is insert a clause into the government's standard model ASC, which is something that you can choose to use if you want to, but you don't have to. And I very seldom come across anyone who actually does. So that clause is in there if you decide to use the model agreement, but you don't have to. So if you don't want to accept pets, you still don't have to. But this is maybe a hint, Rob, and we've seen this before in terms of government statements about what they want landlords to be doing, and maybe this is a bit of a nudge in that direction. And as we've also said on the podcast before, it can be a smart business move to accept pets anyway.
Yeah, there might be other landlords out there who are actually glad that it's not happened for another reason, or it's not mandatory for another reason, because they take advantage of the fact that so many other landlords don't accept pets. Because there is a huge market for it, and because the supply is so short, it means that the landlords that do offer accommodation that allow pets means that they are at an advantage. So I suppose those landlords would be disadvantaged if the supply issues went away, if it became mandatory. We will see. As you said, it could be a nudge, but in the end it looked like landlords were getting a woof deal, but it's actually ended out okay.
I was waiting for it the whole way through. So that's the news, but Rob, before we get into our main topic this week, we need to make people aware not to adjust their podcast players. Any Other Business is indeed coming out on a different day now.
Yeah, if you go into your podcast feed, if you're a subscriber to Any Other Business, which you should be, at least go and check it out, you will now find that the latest episode has come out on a Monday. And all future episodes will be coming out on a Monday as well to kickstart your week. So at 6 a.m. every Monday, the podcast comes out. But for those eager beavers who want more, I want to access it at its first opportunity, the YouTube video will go out on Sunday. So you have the opportunity to get ahead of the working week and watch the episode then. So if you prefer audio, it'll be in your feed every Monday now. And if you want video, you can pick it up a little bit earlier on the Sunday. And even if you do prefer to listen to your podcasts rather than view, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel anyway, because in the future we're going to be bringing out different business videos which won't be on the podcast feed at all and will only be exclusive to YouTube. So make sure you get along to our YouTube channel and subscribe there as well.
And as if that weren't all enough, we're spoiling you with podcast content, but there's a little bit more as well. Because remember, our team holds webinars for property investors every single week. There's a few different time slots available. So if you haven't attended one of those yet, make that happen. You can find out all about them by going to propertyhub.net/action. Back at the start of January, as we do every year, we made our predictions for the year ahead in property. And a couple of weeks back, we went further than that and picked out our hotspots for 2021. So go and listen to that if you haven't done already. Now, I've got kind of conflicting feelings about predictions. We enjoy making them, and we enjoy going back and reviewing how successful those predictions were, which we do every year as well. Whether they're good or bad, it's always entertaining. And predictions can be useful because it's handy to know what people in the property sector who supposedly have an informed opinion think is going to happen, because you can use that to inform your own investing plans. However, predictions are frequently wildly inaccurate. And I'm not just talking about our own here. And there's a risk that if you take predictions too seriously, it can lead you in completely the wrong direction. So what we're going to do in this episode is go back and look at some really significant recent years in property. We're going to look at what happened in those years. And we're going to look at what various people said was going to happen in those years. And as we do that, we'll be spotting some patterns that will be worth keeping in mind as you review predictions in the future. So Rob, Let's start with 2020. Now, there are predictions made at the very start of 2020, but fair enough. Any prediction made back at the start of 2020 we would obviously not expect to be accurate because COVID turned out to be such a curveball. However, round about March time, a lot of people went back and remade predictions in the light of that. So shall we have a review of what those predictions were?
Yeah, we're being fair, aren't we? We're not saying you had to predict the coronavirus. You know the coronavirus exists now. You can weigh up all the possibilities and you can make a judgment. So at the end of the year, property prices actually had risen by 7.6%. Quite significant capital growth. So in March, what did the experts predict? Well, Knight Frank said property prices were going to fall by 3%. So out in total by about 10%. But if you think that's bad, that's a best of a bad bunch. JLL predicted an 8% fall. So out by 15%. CEBR, and they never are bullish on property, predicted a 13% fall. So they were out by 20%. And then you move on to Savills. Now, Savills weren't content with changing their figures in March. They did, but they wanted to keep changing them. So in March, they predicted a 10% fall. A few months later, they revised their figures again in June to a 7.5% fall. And then not content with that prediction, they then went on to make another one in September and predicted 4% growth. Now, at that point, you only had a few months left of the year, and they still got that wrong. And most, if not all, of those companies we've just mentioned have people in their businesses full-time who do this for a living, make predictions, are analysts and just look at the market and produce predictions that are served out to the media and then to us. So these experts weren't even close, not even like anywhere near the numbers that were delivered. And neither were we. We were less wrong than all of those full-time experts. We predicted it to be about neutral. I think we said up to 2% growth. Compared to what everyone else was saying, that was quite a brave and bold prediction to make. We'll come back to later why we made that prediction and why we were so different to everyone else. But I think it's worth saying that even at the time we thought we were being brave and bold, we were still wrong. We were the least wrong, but we were wrong.
Yeah, nobody came out of 2020 with much credit, really, did they? Savills particularly amused me because those three different predictions they made at different points in the year were all revisions to their 5-year forecast. What's the point of making a 5-year forecast if you change it every few months and you're still wrong even after you changed it? It doesn't give me much faith in what they think is going to happen in 5 years. CEBR, to be fair, are sticking to their guns. They predicted a 13% fall and they're now predicting a 13% fall in 2021 instead. So, all right, the timing's off. However, they did miss the 7.5% increase. So even if you do get a 13% fall, it'll still actually be half the fall that they said it was going to be in the first place. But all right, COVID gave rise to a set of circumstances that we've never really seen before. It's the kind of thing that can really throw your models off. It's a factor that nobody was planning for. So you could expect, even in March, the predictions to be a little bit out. But this isn't a one-off. This isn't the only year when people making predictions have done pretty badly. Let's go back and look at a couple of years that were real turning points for the property market. So there are lots of years when not much happens, prices go up a little bit. But when you're predicting, what you really want to be able to do is see those turning points coming so you can position yourself to take advantage of them or protect yourself for them. So an obvious turning point for the property market was 2008. This was the year in which property prices fell by 15.9%, a huge drop. And it's worth noting as well, this didn't come as a complete bolt from the blue. Property prices had already actually started falling a small amount in the second half of 2007. So it wasn't like something just hit out of nowhere in 2008 and caught everyone off guard. So Rob, the actual result was minus 15.9%. What were people predicting?
Nationwide, flat, 0. So just a 16% out. But they weren't alone. Halifax, flat. And Capital Economics, known for their negativity, weren't negative enough. They only predicted minus 5%. So they were still close to 11% off. So even though there was a movement, even though the trend had started to show that this was a bad time, they were still miles away. But 2008, yeah, a big year. Let's give them another go. How about 2013? when property prices rose by 8.4%, a really good year. What did the experts say, Rob?
Well, again, this year was a huge turning point. This was the year in which the property market really started getting going again after that big crash of 2008. There were a few years where not much happened. 2013, as you just said, everything really kicked off again. So what did everyone think was going to happen? Savills said that prices would be up 0.5%, so about 8% out there. Knight Frank said that house prices would be flat. Their quote, in fact, was, UK house prices will not reach their 2007 peak until 2019, the longest housing market recovery on record. That turned out not to be the case. And Home Track were more negative than that. They predicted a 1% fall. So another huge turning point year, a year you would have wanted to be positioned for, a year when if you'd invested in the average UK property, you'd have seen growth of 8.4% in a single year. You couldn't find anyone predicting growth of more than 0.5%.
So as we've demonstrated, the experts have got this wrong, not just once, but multiple times. And they'll continue to get it wrong in the future. But there's a logical reason why. And this is not just for people who make property predictions. This is for anybody who tends to make predictions around the economy. Economists get it really wrong as well. The vast majority of economists didn't see the '08 crash coming. You hear about the odd one who did, because they made their name off it because they were the outliers. They were the lone voice. Everyone else was saying, no, this will continue. Strong growth will continue. But yet, '08 showed us that was far, far from the case. And that's because it's natural just to project what's happening right now going forward. It's the easiest thing to do. And if you're in the business of making predictions, it's the safest thing to do as well.
It is. It's the safest thing to do, because if you're saying, okay, well, prices went up a little bit last year, so they'll go up a little bit more again this year at the same kind of rate, that's an easy prediction to make. If you're putting a stake in the ground and saying, no, this has changed now, this is going to happen instead, then you're going to look far more silly if you're wrong. It's far safer to be wrong along with everyone else. Until a couple of smartasses dig it up on a podcast 12 years later, no one's going to remember that Nationwide said that house prices were going to be flat in 2008. It felt like a fairly safe thing to do. In fact, they were horrendously wrong, but no one's going to really remember because they said the same as everyone else. If they'd said, you know what, guys, we think property prices are going to fall by 16%, and then they hadn't, then everyone would still be talking about that now. So there's very little incentive to do anything other than project the current state of affairs forward. You could also, incidentally, argue that because a lot of these companies coming out with predictions are property companies, they've got a vested interest of giving an optimistic view and not predicting house price falls. And there's definitely an element of truth in that, but then look at the 2020 predictions. There were some really chunky drops predicted in there, which turned out not to be the case. So actually they were too negative.
And a lot of these experts will have models, they'll have spreadsheets that'll help them make predictions. But the problem with spreadsheets is that they'll focus on the micro. Their data will all be micro level, and they'll be reasonably correct most years, as we've already said. But what they fail to account for, at least it seems to us, is that the macro levels, the common sense economics, that's what they seem to ignore. They seem to get more interested in what's happening at ground level rather than looking at what's happening at the high level, and that's why they get it so wrong. When you look back to the predictions earlier this year, the reason why we weren't as negative as everyone else is because common sense said that the government would stimulate their way out of this, and when there's stimulus, asset prices do well. They're not just going to let the country collapse and go to its knees. They're going to offer support, and they did through furlough, they did through stamp duty holiday, they did through multiple other measures. That, to me, was obvious that they would step in and do something. But that is thinking at a macro, a high level, or using what I would just call common sense to think it through and go, well, what are the scenarios here? What's likely to play out? But they don't work that way. So that's why they'll be looking reasonably good most years, but if anything dramatic happens, they're going to be way out.
And you know what? Something else that I think that everyone missed in 2020, including us, is the human element. You've got a lot of very clever people with very clever spreadsheets, but none of them take account of people's psychology. And the clearest example of that was in 2020. You can point to a lot of reasons why house prices did well in 2020 when they weren't supposed to, according to people making predictions. And some of it will be the stimulus and some of it will be the stamp duty. But quite a lot of it, I think it's hard to argue otherwise, is people spending a lot of time at home suddenly, having change of priorities, deciding they wanted to change something. 2020 obviously is quite an extreme example of that, but psychology is a factor every year. And that tends not to get factored into predictions because it sounds a bit wishy-washy, I guess. It's easier to have a spreadsheet with lots of economic data going into it and trust the number that comes out at the end. But if as a forecaster you said, well, yeah, I looked at that, but actually I think people are thinking that, it just doesn't sound very convincing. But actually, I think if you chucked out all the data and just thought about what people are going to be thinking, you'd probably end up doing better.
So why have we done this? We've not done it to mock these fine institutions that we've talked about. Far from it. It's more for you to take the lesson that you shouldn't listen to anyone, including us, really, if you're making an investment based on a prediction. You shouldn't do that. We've talked about hotspots, and we believe those hotspots will do well. And to reassure you, it's been done on what I would call common sense economics. We've not rolled out our spreadsheets to make those predictions, but we still could be wrong. And as we demonstrated, the experts who do this full time can be very, very wrong. So build your own plans out, understand your reasons for investing, and make common sense decisions. Don't get caught up in the hype. Don't get caught up in the media spin. Don't let the media be your investment guide, because the media is fed their stories by people like this, and it's also fed stories by sensationalists. They're not who you want to be listening to. Think about it yourself, think about your own environment, think about what's happening around you, and just make rational investment decisions. Don't speculate. And here's the wonderful thing about property. Even if you get it wrong, even if you invest in one of these freak years that property prices fall, the good news is that it will recover over time. History has shown us that. And that if you invest, there are more good years than bad. People will often say, should I not invest right now because there's a crash might come? It might, but it might be 10 years away. And what if it is? You've missed 10 years of growth, which would more than compensate for any crash. In fact, often, just 2 or 3 years of growth will compensate for a crash. So you don't have to worry. If you're in this for the long term, you can relax.
And the other point that I think is really important and easy to miss is that whenever people are making predictions, they're always made about national averages. People are always talking about what happens to the average UK property. But you're never going to be buying the average UK property. The performance of your particular portfolio can be completely different from the average, depending on where you're buying, the type of property you're buying, and that kind of thing. Now, when you have an extreme year, like the crash of 2008, no one's coming out of that year well. There's not like there are parts of the country where prices actually went up, but the 16%-ish fall was an average. Some places will have been worse. Some places will have been better. And that's just extreme years. When you're looking at your average year when prices might go up a couple of percent, in that case, a national average or even a city average doesn't tell you much because your particular portfolio could be completely different. There'll be other factors at play. And all of this, of course, is before anything that you do, such as managing to buy at a good price or add value and all that kind of thing. So the main lesson to take away from this episode is something that Rob said earlier. Don't let the media be your investment guide. By all means, listen to people, try to understand the underlying reasons behind what they're saying, but assess how valid they are yourself. Don't just take it for granted that they're going to be right, because as we've seen, they're normally wrong, us included. You've also got to take account of your own situation. If you're planning to flip a property and be in and out within 6 months, then what happens within the next year is exceptionally important. If you're planning to hold for the next 20 years, less so. So by all means, use predictions for entertainment. And okay, maybe use the underlying reasons as one factor in making your own investment plans. But you need to come to your own view about what property is going to do, not just over the next year, but over the whole of your investing lifespan, and use that to make your decisions.
Now, as you've heard, some of our experts, at least in some years, haven't had much success. But it's time for our success story of the week now to lift us back up and hear about someone who's been doing very well.
Yes, thank you to listener Just Jess C for leaving us a podcast review. It says, I've done it. I've gone back and listened to every single episode over the space of a year and taken action. I first came across the Property Podcast last August and loved it. Decided to go right back to the beginning and listen through, which seemed like a big undertaking at the time. The two Robs and their guests have since inspired me to take some big actions. I've widened my networking presence, volunteered and done casual work with a property company, set up 2 property-related businesses, sourcing and home staging and interior design, positively developed my mindset as well as goal-setting process, and I'm just about to begin work on my first JV to add to the buy-to-let that kicked this all off. Thank you, Rob and Rob, for the inspiration. Looking forward to what the next year brings. Well, success is whatever you define it as, and you can define going back and listening to every single episode of the Property Podcast as success. You could argue it's a bit mad, but thank you anyway. But everything that you've done as a result of that, huge success in anyone's book. You've done the important bit. Listening to the podcast is the easy bit, and hopefully you'll pick up a lot from it, but it doesn't count for anything unless you actually do something with it. But you've very much done a lot with it, so well done to you.
Time for Hub Extra now, and Rob, you want to draw attention to a podcast that you've recently listened to.
Yeah, not just a podcast that I've listened to, but a podcast which is put together by one of the investors who we feature on our regular Journey series. So there are several investors who we try to catch up with at least once a year who we've been following along their property journeys. One of them is Sarah, and it turns out that Sarah, as well as doing great things in property, has created her own podcast. And the way this podcast came about is pretty incredible. Her sister was dating a guy who, while they were still dating, she found out was a con artist. And somehow, Sarah and her sister had the presence of mind to not just gather evidence against him without tipping him off, but also record all of it to make a podcast about it. It's not just the premise that's great. The quality of this podcast is amazing. You'd never know that it was made by a couple of individuals who'd never done it before, rather than an experienced podcast producer. It's super high quality. It's really entertaining, and it's really inspiring to see someone achieving something so impressive, not just in the property world, but in a completely different world as well. So well done to Sarah. And if you'd like to listen to that podcast, which is called Conning the Con, you can find the link to that in today's show notes.
So that's us done for another week. Thank you very much for listening. But don't worry if you're craving for more. You could do what Jess did from our success story and go back and listen to the hundreds of episodes we've already done. If that's not quite your commitment level, then don't worry. We're back on Tuesday with Ask Rob and Rob and the Property Podcast on Thursday. And of course, if you want even more, you can go and listen to the AOB Any Other Business podcast, which is brand spanking new. So plenty to keep you busy with. But of course, the main podcast will be here, same time, same place next week. Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.